It's day 245. It's also January 6th, 2020, and we are in Del Rio, Texas.
You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description.
Del Rio. Yep, we went south. And around 180 miles from Fort Stockton, we arrived in this place called Del Rio, a border town, connected to Ciudad Acuña by the Lake Amistad Dam International Crossing and the Del Rio Ciudad Acuña International Bridge. And it came as no surprise that there's a ton of history packed into this community of just over 30,000. And while 30K isn't really the small town thing we're going for these days, we found an awesome recreation area just a few miles outside town. And the January weather around here is pretty hard to beat. So we quickly decided this would be a great place to hang out for a few days and learn. Oh, and a quick reminder, I am so bad at remembering to mention that anyone out there not listening or watching on Spotify or YouTube, that there is a video version of this podcast. I take tons of photos on our adventure. So if you're interested in visuals while listening, check us out on either Spotify or YouTube. Or, better yet, visit lifeoutthere.me. Anything and everything you might be curious about can be found on our website. You can even email us or leave us a voicemail. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, coming out of Fort Stockton, we had learned so much, from learning of how integral both the Apache and the Comanche people had been in the historical formation of what we call the United States today. How they hadn't told me in school, or if they did, I wasn't listening. And let's face it, that is a distinct possibility. But in either case, I had no idea that had it not been for the Native Americans in the region fending off the settlement attempts of both Spain and then Mexico, hundreds of years before any of our ancestors showed up, well, our ancestors might very likely have met with a very different fate. And the entire southwestern part of the U.S. would have ended, right around Louisiana-ish. And then what would have happened to the rest of the country as we know it today? Who knows? Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, Montana, who knows? I guess the biggest takeaway is that timing is indeed everything. And I've said it before, history is written by the winners. And we won. And by we, I mean they, our ancestors. It's not like I was brandishing a Kentucky long rifle atop a horse at full gallop with a Colt revolver on my hip taking out Comanche warriors. Our ancestors were. And because of them, we have these United States. And specifically where I'm sitting today, Del Rio. As the sun lowered in the sky, the horizon was taking on that glow. The glow I've seen and felt in many places across this part of the country, a glow very specific to the West. Our journey from Fort Stockton to Del Rio played out like a high-definition movie, rich with the textures and hues of the Texas landscape. The vast stretch of US 90 East lay before us, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the rugged terrain, whispering tales of pioneers and settlers who once traversed these paths. But their ribbon of road was a dusty trail, traversed on wooden wheels on wagons. Their journey measured in days and weeks, not hours. The Chihuahuan Desert, in its stark beauty, flanked the highway with an endless procession of mesquite trees and resilient creosote bushes. Sagebrush swayed gently in the arid breeze, their silvery leaves catching the last light of day. And occasionally, the landscape gave way to rocky outcrops and distant mesas, their ancient forms etched against a sky that seemed to stretch on forever. And as we got closer to Del Rio, the land began to, soften? The harsh edges of the desert giving way to the rolling hills and verdant stretches of the Rio Grande Valley. The air grew warmer and more humid, carrying with it the subtle scent of wildflowers and the sudden hint of water. I could feel the shift, as if the land itself was welcoming us to another storied border town. Turning on to Veterans Boulevard, we were greeted by a modest town, a town unfolding in front of us with a blend of the old and the new. Adobe buildings with their earthy hues stood alongside more modern structures, their facades reflecting the cultural tapestry of this unique borderland. The streets were quiet, a gentle reminder of the town's laid-back pace. And passing by local shops and restaurants, I could see glimpses of daily life. A father guiding his son on a bicycle, an elderly couple enjoying ice cream on a bench, a group of teenagers chatting animatedly outside a cafe. The community felt tight-knit. It felt comfortable, bound together by the shared history of the land they call home. And continuing, we turned onto US 277 North, heading towards the Amistad National Recreation Area. The road led us past lush farmlands and sprawling ranches, their boundaries marked by rustic wooden fences and windmills turning lazily in the evening breeze. The landscape grew more vibrant with every mile, a testament to the life-giving waters of the Rio Grande. As we approached the recreation area, the Amistad Reservoir came into view, its shimmering surface reflecting the colors of the setting sun. The lake, created by the confluence of the Rio Grande, Devils, and Pecos rivers, sprawled majestically, an oasis in this arid land. The surrounding hills dotted with oak and cedar trees, at times framing the waters, but in between, still plenty of that wide-open Texas. And pulling into the recreation area, I actually felt a sense of tranquility. The sounds of nature filled the air, the distant call of a hawk, the gentle rustling of dried-up leaves shuffling across the ground, the lapping of water against the shore. Setting up camp for the night, I took a moment to absorb it all. The rich history of Del Rio whispering through the landscape, a testament to the resilience and spirit of a pretty remarkable place. And all this in January. No freezing, no snow, not even any rain in the forecast. Instead, nights might dip into the 40s, but days are reliably in the 60s and 70s. So in other words, perfect, right? In Del Rio, just like everywhere else, and I know it's redundant at this point to even say it as we pull into each new learning adventure, but at the same time, I feel like it's important to keep reminding myself that these lands were inhabited by Native Americans for thousands of years prior to any of us white guys showing up. Here, evidence of their presence includes rock art and artifacts found throughout the Amistad National Recreation Area. It was all the way back in 1767 when the Spanish explorer Marquis de Ruby visited the area during his inspection tour of Texas. And 67 years later, in 1834, James Grant and John Charles Beals attempted to establish a settlement on the San Felipe Creek. But that was short-lived. The Native Americans in the area, well, they just weren't having it, and their constant raids sent those first settlers packing. It would not be until the 1850s that the area would begin to attract permanent settlers. In 1883, the town was officially named San Felipe del Rio by Spanish missionaries. The name was in honor of the nearby San Felipe Springs. Del Rio, translated, means of the river. But soon after, in 1885, the name was shortened to Del Rio, to avoid confusion with another town in Texas already named San Felipe. Now, unlike other areas we've been through, Del Rio remained relatively quiet, almost unscathed during the turbulent Indian War era, the Mexican-American War, and even the American Civil War. There were occasional skirmishes in the area, but nothing like the rest of the state would experience. And for over a century, the area would remain quiet, a quiet little agricultural area straddling the U.S. and Mexican border. But in 1943, things would change when the U.S. Air Force came to town and installed Laughlin Air Force Base, the largest pilot training base in the United States Air Force. The base was initially formed to train fighter pilots in the operation of the Marauder bomber planes during World War II, and the population of military personnel on the base quickly rose to over 3,000. The Air Force chose Del Rio because of its location. It's private and remote. Very little air traffic in the area, combined with favorable weather patterns for most of the year, meant that pilots could train hard, year-round, with little interruption or interference. The location also ensures privacy, secrecy even, when testing the latest developments in military aircraft. The base would be deactivated briefly after the war, but it would be reactivated in the 1950s to become the training facility it is today. The base is dedicated to training pilots for the United States Air Force, the Air Force Reserve, Air National Guard, and even several NATO and allied nations. So yeah, wannabe pilots come to Laughlin from all over the world to become the very best. And today, nearly 4,800 personnel occupy the base, including both military personnel and civilian contractors, making the base an integral part of Del Rio. And then there's the Amistad NRA. NRA? Yeah, not those gun guys. In these parts, NRA stands for National Recreation Area. It's also the place that we've called home for the last week or so. Now let's go back a little. In 1944, a water treaty between the U.S. and Mexico was signed, and that would lead to the eventual construction of the Amistad Dam. Construction of the dam began in 1963 and was completed in 1969. The dam was constructed as a means of flood control in the region, a source of hydroelectric power, as well as shared water management throughout the region. So in many respects, unremarkable for the period. But what is remarkable is that the Amistad Dam's installation marked the second, and to this day, remains one of only 2 instances in which the U.S., in collaboration with another nation, built a dam that crosses the border with Mexico, and created a reservoir that shares borders as well. The International Boundary and Water Commission would be formed and is responsible for the operation and maintenance of the dam. The costs associated with the dam are shared between the United States and Mexico. The U.S. covers about 57% of the costs, and Mexico picks up the other 43%. The division of costs is in accordance with the Water Treaty that one back in 1944, and the division of water storage rights in the reservoir. The reservoir created by the installation of the dam covers nearly 65,000 acres and is the third largest in the state, the ninth largest in the United States. So with the dam complete, water management in place, and a 65,000-acre, shiny, brand-new lake in place, the Amistad National Recreation Area would be established in November of 1965. Over 58,000 acres would be set aside around the lake to provide safe habitat for the area's wildlife and plant life, and in doing so, Texas also had one more place for outdoor enthusiasts to enjoy boating, fishing, camping, hiking, rock art viewing, and even hunting, in what many refer to as the Oasis in West Texas. Oh, and the name, Amistad? Well, that comes from the Spanish word meaning friendship. Pretty fitting, right? Two nations had come together, worked together, spent together, and managed together to harness the natural resources in the area to serve both nations. Now, our explorations around Amistad would include stops at 3 different campsites: Governor's Landing, San Pedro, and 277 North, each offering their very own personality. And talking with a park ranger just yesterday, I was interested to learn more about that water treaty with Mexico. He was explaining the low levels of the lake this year. He said that the lake used to be about 30 to 40 feet higher and much closer to the campsites, but that recent diversions of water to Mexico had dropped shorelines dramatically over the past couple of years. And this all has to do with provisions in that water treaty regarding where and when the fresh water will be diverted to specific areas in either country to preserve wildlife, both plant and animal. San Pedro, where we're parked at the moment, is a few miles back from the lake. So water levels are currently so low that the lake can't even be seen from here. And as a result, the scenery has shifted to low-growing trees and various types of low-growing desert shrubs that have adapted to the rocky soil and the limestone base. Once again, the word forest means something much different visually here than it does in many other parts of the country. It's also interesting to read that the Amistad area, while it looks like a desert, does not actually meet the true definition of a desert, and in fact is classified as a subtropical climate. The area can be influenced by storms coming in off the Gulf of Mexico, raising its annual rainfall levels well above that of a typical desert. This explains the difference in plant species as you head west into New Mexico and Arizona, where the deserts are far more sparse in vegetation and primarily of the cactus variety. And it's also interesting to note that, given the unique climate, the area contains several species of plants and reptiles, 3 of which are on the state's protected species list and cannot be found anywhere else in the world. So thinking about the fact that we're walking through the mesquite tree forest that can be seen nowhere else on the planet certainly makes a walk through this desert forest with Dougie a much different experience here than our treks around the deserts of Arizona. And given all this, it makes complete sense that Texas, unlike most anywhere else we've been so far, strictly prohibits and enforces the use of off-road vehicles in these areas. All traffic in and out of Amistad must stay on, quote-unquote, maintained roads, most of which are dirt. And the park rangers can be seen several times a day monitoring this activity. One of the campsites we stayed in even provided electrical, and Texas provides potable water, fish cleaning stations, and even RV dump stations in some of these areas, which explains why so many folks take advantage of the welcoming stay limit of 60 days in certain areas of the recreation area. Point being, there are tons of places to park the RV, if you're into exploring the many unique characteristics of the Chihuahuan Desert. And most anything you might need is just up the road a few miles in Del Rio, including, I'll throw this in, some pretty good mechanics. During our stay here, we experienced some issues with the starter on Vacilando. Comforting to learn that a quick online search would land us in the hands of Deltex RV and Auto Repair Center. The folks at Deltex were extremely helpful and professional, and within 24 hours they had us back up and running with a brand new starter, installed and warranted. Thanks, guys. Oh, and a funny story. While talking with that park ranger, I asked if he had any recommendations for boondocking opportunities in the area, places where one might find a bit more solitude. He immediately began telling me of an area a few miles outside the National Recreation Area, but in the middle of giving us directions, he stopped and asked, "Wait, you're packing, right?" And for some reason, that went right over my head. And I guess a puzzled look on my face told him that he should caution me against that area. He went on to say that it's probably not a good idea to head out that way alone and unarmed. And it's pretty insightful of him to expound a bit and explain that the threats in the area can just as often come in the form of two-legged critters as they do from predators of the four-legged variety. I'd instantly had the realization that just because I am packing, as the ranger put it, it didn't necessarily mean that I should go deliberately looking for trouble. Borderland, as beautiful and consuming and wide open as it is, sadly, comes with threats as well. And while what we hear on the news may at times get blown a bit out of proportion, Borderland does indeed come with the presence of some pretty unsavory characters. Characters I'd do best to stay away from. We'll leave those folks to the Border Patrol. You know, those guys that keep ignoring me? And speaking of Border Patrol, during one of my afternoon outings in the car, I'd found a dirt road on the other side of the highway that looked to head deeper down into the canyon and nearer the shoreline of the lake. As I carefully traversed the dirt road, working my way nearer the lake through the sagebrush, I rounded a corner and was startled to pass a big black SUV backed in off the road, just sitting there in the brush. As I passed by, I glanced to my left to quickly observe a scene, well, straight out of Men in Black. Two sunglass-clad men in the front seat of that big black SUV were carefully observing me as I passed by. And as their SUV passed from my side view to my rearview mirror, I once again found myself wishing they would just come and stop me, ask me some questions, so I could in turn ask them some questions. But alas, I guess a middle-aged, gray-haired white guy in a little electric car or a 30-year-old RV just doesn't scream national security threat. And again, they seem to show little interest. Now, I do realize that for all I know, they had, within seconds, run my license plates and compared the photo on my driver's license to me, the guy in the driver's seat, and assessed my threat level way beyond anything I could imagine even. But still, I had wished they'd come talk to me. I wanted to go talk to them, but that felt weird too. Maybe I'll get over it and go talk to them one of these days. Those two were of particular interest to me because they weren't in one of those green and white pickups. They looked more like Secret Service or CIA, FBI even. I don't know. Guess I'll never know. And on our last night in the Amistad NRA, I did a quick check-in on the news. I haven't done a great job of checking the news lately. I think I might have mentioned it in a couple of other episodes that I oftentimes get frustrated with what's being shared with us in the mainstream or legacy media. How much effort it takes to just get to the facts without the spin of whatever media outlet I'm listening to. But at the same time, I feel like I gotta do a better job of checking in from time to time for an overall awareness of what's going on out there and how it might affect me, or how I might be able to affect it. Tonight was particularly timely, given where we were and what I had just learned. I'd tuned into a local channel, and after around 15 minutes of listening to how we were, I guess, still in the middle of a partial government shutdown, you know, that seemingly election year thing that we have to listen to every couple years. A story around how the government can't get its head out of its own butt and agree on a budget. Particularly frustrating for me, given that in the universe I come from, well, a budget, that's kind of the law of the land. And if you couldn't come up with, and then manage to, a budget, well, then you were just fired. Because if you couldn't do the job, somebody else certainly could. But apparently, our government, not so simple. But it could be. I mean, really, it's a budget. But apparently this go-around, the sticking point is that glorious wall that our president promised those of you that voted for him, Mexico would pay for. Well, Mexico kinda didn't pay for it, which I think we all knew would be the case. And now, here we are, arguing about who will pay for it. Oh, man, it's sometimes hard to believe that we pay those guys. I also learned that the 76th annual Golden Globes had been aired, honoring achievements in film and television, 'cause that's newsworthy. And apparently this Brexit thing is continuing. The UK's impending departure from the European Union continues to dominate the headlines all across Europe, and apparently the world. And I'm still not even sure that I know exactly what that is or why it matters to me. But nonetheless, now I know that those guys over there in Europe are continuing to argue about it. And then they talked about some guy named Bolsonaro being elected president in Brazil. Now that resonated for a quick second because it represented a sudden shift in Brazil from left-leaning policy to right, ousting policy and politicians that had been in place for years in favor of a more conservative direction, with the good of the people as opposed to the government, according to him anyway, being at the top of the agenda. It resonated for a second because that's kind of sort of what happened here. Just like 4 years ago. A time when apparently a huge portion of the American public had gotten so fed up with politics as usual that the country decided to cast aside those politics as usual and elect a complete moron to be our president. And having the benefit of hindsight for the last 3 years, all I could think was, good luck, Brazil. I was reaching over to turn off the television when a story about the Amistad Reservoir was teased. And rather than me trying to articulate what they shared, here, have a look for yourself.
On this trip to the border, the line, as we've been calling it the last couple of days, we still have some miles to go before we're done. But we want to go back to Del Rio now, where we spent a lot of our time yesterday, and talk about the mystery that is Lake Amistad. Its name is a Spanish word for friendship, but like a lot of things along the border, it seems to have a perception problem. Lake Amistad is huge. It spans across both the United States and the Mexico borders. But when it comes to businesses, Amistad is drying up.
Look at it. It's the most beautiful lake in Texas.
On a hot summer day, it seems like the perfect cruise. Water, wakes, and a whole lot of lake.
Gorgeous emerald green water. Nobody out here. Totally undeveloped. How much better does it get?
Mark Lewis is a fan of Amistad. He leases ranches across the border. On this day, we basically have the water to ourselves. not great when you're making a living off the lake. Why aren't people coming down here?
I don't know. I mean, we're close to San Antonio. We're close to Austin. All they need to do is just show up.
John Ducharme is an Amistad outfitter, a fishing and hunting guide who's afraid the lake's proximity to Mexico is the reason people shy away from Amistad.
People have that in their mind. It is incorrect, 100% incorrect. We have never had an incident on this lake. And I fish Mexico every day and have never had a problem.
We are literally right on the dividing line here. This buoy, as a matter of fact, marks the border. Behind you is the United States. Behind me is Mexico.
I have no clue why people don't come down here, except for the publicity that Mexico's gotten.
Publicity or misperceptions, we only saw 2 other boats in the 2 hours we were on the lake. One was the Border Patrol. Businesses or boats, Amistad seems to be a tough sell. Yeah, there are a lot of things happening on Lake Amistad, including the fact there are actually no motels that have been able to make it around Lake Amistad right now. And a lot of people getting Amistad and Falcon Lakes mixed up. There were some incidents at Falcon. There have been no incidents at Amistad. By the way, I want to thank my friend Mark Lewis for taking...
It was the mention of the Falcon Reservoir in this video that led me to dig a bit deeper into what they were referring to when they spoke of the incidents on Falcon Reservoir. And before I knew it, I was in the middle of that one more click thing. The Falcon Reservoir. That other reservoir in Texas that shares a border with Mexico. But it's had a troubled past. Interestingly, the dam was completed in 1953, creating the reservoir, and the first 57 years would be relatively quiet. There were the occasional reports of illegal activity on the Mexican side of the lake. But then, in 2010, a man named David Hartley would be murdered by Mexican pirates on the lake. And the tragic story of David and his surviving wife Tiffany, well, they were just out jet skiing when they crossed to the Mexican side of the lake to take photos of a partially submerged historic church. It was then that pirates would emerge from the shrubs surrounding the shoreline and begin shooting at the couple, and David would be killed, while Tiffany would escape on her jet ski. The incident became headlines throughout the country and remains unsolved to this day. Now some point to perhaps holes in Tiffany's accounting of the events. And the case remains unsolved to this day because David was never found, nor was his jet ski. But many point out that that is because the area in which he was shot is within the borders of Mexico, which seriously hampered search efforts. Even the Mexican government reports that the area can be quite dangerous due to drug cartel activity and should be avoided. And for the next decade, reports of drug cartel activity and illegal smuggling, even illegal fishing, would continue to increase. But thankfully, no other deaths have been reported as of 2019. In 2015, authorities in the area would continue to ramp up their patrol activity and multiple arrests and confiscations would take place in the area. And it appears that continued diligence has been effective in restoring safety to the area, to a certain extent anyways. And all this, just 276 miles from where we are here in the Amistad NRA. And I thought back to my experience in Columbus, and that sense of security, and sometimes the lack of it, based on where we are. And it probably goes without saying that the challenges we face with our borders aren't always about the land and the roads we've driven along while staring off into Mexico. Those borders are also about the water, and not just that Rio Grande that we've read so much about, but now I know of a couple lakes too. I decided that we'd head out in the morning. But where? I mean, we could still travel nearly 400 miles south before running out of Texas. Or there's that 400 or so miles straight east in front of us before we run into Houston or get anywhere near the eastern borders of Texas. I'm not sure yet. But whatever direction we head, I wonder what we'll learn there.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few. Because you can. No, seriously, you can.